Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all as our panelists here for lending your expertise and your insight to help us better legislate, and especially thank you to Dr. Georges for, as a professor at Lehman College, for representing the Bronx so well here in this body. I have a question. I wanted to continue a little bit on my colleague from California's line of questioning about public investment in research and development. I guess you would say that this is, would it be correct, Dr. Kesselheim, to characterize the NIH money that is being used in development and research as an early investment?
Yes.
So the public is acting as an early investor in the production of these drugs. Is the public receiving any sort of direct return on that investment from the highly profitable drugs that are developed from that research?
No, in most cases, there isn't. When those products are eventually handed off to a for-profit company, there aren't licensing deals that bring money back into the coffers of the NIH. That usually doesn't happen.
So the public is acting as an early investor, putting tons of money in the development of drugs that then become privatized, and then they receive no return on the investment that they have made.
Right.
Dr. Anderson, I have a question. Since you study comparative insurance systems, are there models where the public does receive returns on investments in other insurance models across the world?
There are a few, but they're relatively uncommon.
Mm-hmm. And how does that tend to work?
So essentially, if the places at the UK or someplace like that have invested money in it, they will get some rate of return on those investments. But again, it's relatively uncommon.
Mm-hmm. I also have one question for Dr. Georges, and please stop me if I'm going out of the scope of your expertise. As a nurse, in your experience as a nurse, do you have knowledge of the VA? Like in general knowledge of the VA and how the VA works?
Some knowledge.
And in your experience, is the VA as a public-owned and operated operation, rather, are the drug prices in the VA lower or higher or the same?
Well, that I
as
can't
what we see
speak
in
to. I
general.
don't have that kind of knowledge.
They tend to be much lower
So
than in other places in the
So
they tend
about 31% lower than what Medicare pays.
So the VA tends to be lower. And can you explain why, anyone on the panel, why that is?
So, well, in part because the VA gets some automatic statutory rebates based on the drugs that it buys, but also because the VA negotiates on behalf of all of the members of the VA and is able to use its marketing power to try to negotiate that. And also because it takes a very thoughtful approach to developing its formulary and can use inclusion on its formulary as another way of trying to negotiate a fair price for the product.
So you would say, and am I correct in saying that the VA is using collective bargaining power in the market to lower the price of drugs as a counter to some of the for-profit or profit motive pressures, upward pressures on the cost of pharmaceuticals?
Right. Yes.
Okay, great. And I guess one last question in my remaining time. If you all could ask us, to act as members of Congress and do one thing, one action, what would that action be?
So I think, for me, it's external reference prices. And that's something that President Trump has proposed in Medicare Part B, to pay 126% of what the other countries do. I'm not sure I would agree with the countries that he chose, but essentially to pay 123%. If right now in the Medicare Part D, which is most of the money, we pay about 3 to 4 times what other countries pay for the same drugs. I don't think we can bring it down to what they pay or 126% of it, but we could bring it down a lot.
I tend to think external reference pricing is not a good idea, and I think that what we should do is actually get our own house in order and negotiate and try to evaluate the value and comparative and cost effectiveness of drugs better in the U.S. and try to determine what the right price is for U.S. patients rather than relying on what the prices are in other countries. But if I could say one thing that we could do, I think it would be to, again, try to develop a system where the government could try to identify what the fair price is for a drug and what are reasonable prices for the drug based on the value that the drug provides to patients, and then use that to negotiate with the pharmaceutical manufacturer to try to get a more effective price that we provide.
We in AARP would like you to have HHS be allowed to negotiate lower drug prices on behalf of Medicare beneficiaries.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
Mr.
Thank you,
Chair,
Ms. Presley.
Last month, President Trump declared a, quote, national emergency concerning the southern border of the United States under the National Emergencies Act. And, my colleagues wanted to talk about the southern border with relation to the opioid crisis, so let's talk about it. Because even at the time that he declared this emergency, he said himself, quote, I didn't need to do this. But he did. And at the time the president declared this emergency, the White House issued a statement that, quote, he would be using his legal authority to take executive action to secure additional resources. And he's transferred millions of dollars even from FEMA to ICE. The statement said that the administration had identified funding that could be transferred from other agencies as well. This includes up to $2.5 billion that he's transferred from the Department of Defense and up to $3.6 billion reallocated from military construction projects. So that's one national emergency he's identified. But about a year and a half ago, the president issued a declaration indicating that opioids also constitute a public health emergency. Director Carroll, today, how much funding has the administration transferred from other agencies to address the opioid public health emergency?
If you're referring to the opioid emergency that was declared 18 months or so ago, very little money was actually transferred over. I'm not sure of the exact amount, but it was not very much money.
Right. We're seeing here, there's evidence that almost no money was transferred from other agencies. So we have two national emergencies, one declared on the southern border where the president transfers and is taking away millions of dollars from other agencies to address a wall, which doesn't even solve these issues when we're seeing that it's focused on ports of entry. But second, when we actually—
May I address that, actually? In terms of if you just go by weight, and I can break it down by drug if you would like, but and the numbers that I have from Customs and Border Protection for 2018 reflects the total weight of drugs at ports of entry in 2018 was 432,000 pounds of various drugs. Between ports of entry for the same time frame, fiscal year 2018, 476,000.
So actually more even.
In terms of total weight, I can break it down by drug if you want.
So here's my big question I want to ask for the other side. Because just a few weeks ago, that enough fentanyl was captured to kill 57 million Americans. You remember this story when this happened? Yeah, just a few weeks back, right?
Yes, sir.
So if that's not an emergency, somebody tell me what is. Enough fentanyl to kill 58 million? 59 million? How bad does it have to get before we actually say this is an emergency? Mr. Carroll, is there a drug crisis emergency on our southern border?
Yes, sir. There's a drug crisis in our country, and all of the drugs that are here are coming into our country. The fatal drugs are coming from overseas, Mexico, China.
I do think that we here in Congress have responsibility as well. The Public Health Emergency Fund has only at most $57,000 in it. And it has not been really funded congressionally in a long time. So I think that that's an area where we can accept some personal responsibility.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. McDaniel, the Democrats have said there's no crisis, no emergency on the southern border. In your judgment, in your, I think, 20-some years of experience, is there an illegal drug crisis, illegal drug emergency on our southern border?
Yes, sir.
There is?
Yes, sir.
Is there a gang and cartel crisis and emergency on our southern border?
Yes, sir.
And is there also a human trafficking crisis emergency situation on our southern border?
Yes, there is.
So there is, all three?
Yes, sir.
We got a drug emergency, we got a human trafficking emergency, we got a gang and cartel emergency on our southern border. Mr. Carroll, is there a drug crisis emergency on our southern border?
Yes, sir. There's a drug crisis in our country, and all of the drugs that are here are coming into our country. The fatal drugs are coming from overseas, Mexico, China.
Is there also a gang and drug cartel problem on our southern border?
Absolutely. There's no question.
And associated with this cartel activity is a human trafficking problem on our southern border. Would you call that an emergency or crisis as well?
And they're absolutely related, because these traffickers who are just completely morally depraved will trade anything. They'll trade in drugs, they'll trade in weapons, they'll trade in children, they'll trade in human lives.
So we got two experts here today, Mr. Chairman, on our panel, two experts with experience in this area, one 20-some years in law enforcement, who says there's a drug crisis emergency, there's a human trafficking crisis emergency, there is a gang and cartel violence emergency on our district, or on our southern border. Let me go back to another point that was raised earlier. One of the earlier members, I believe it was Ms. Wasserman Schultz, said 90% of drugs captured are captured at ports of entry. And Mr. Higgins disagreed with that. But let's just assume for a second that Ms. Wasserman Schultz is right. Mr. McDaniel, does it surprise you that drugs are captured where there's actually law enforcement personnel?
No, sir. No surprise at all.
That's kind of common sense, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Like, wow, we're actually capturing drugs where there are law enforcement personnel at the ports of entry. But we're also capturing some where there aren't ports of entry, and my guess is, call me just some common sense guy from Western Ohio, my guess is a lot of drugs are moving across the border where there aren't any good guys to stop them, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. And hence the reason we need a barrier, hence the reason we need some kind of border security wall to help with that situation, to deal with this crisis that's all over our country, as the Director points out. Would you agree with that, Mr. McDaniel?
I would agree with that.
It's just good common sense. So this argument that, oh, most of the drugs seized are at ports of entry, well, for goodness sakes, that's where we have law enforcement right there. Of course that's going to happen. But there is all kinds of bad stuff coming across where there aren't the good guys to stop the bad stuff.